You look at social media, you look at it as, this big entertainment thing, and you all on Facebook, you're on Instagram, whatever, and you sharing, and you look at it as a way that, you can, entertain yourself and, interact with others. But you got to look at these corporations, data, like you said, is real powerful. And social media is for the people who collect and gather data and the people who need it. Social media is either you a shooter or you a target. I'm Munir Bell-Ali, you know what I'm saying? One of the founders of an organization, online community called Building Boss Up Network. And, I've spent the last 20 years of my life dedicated towards addressing the conditions in the Black community and finding a practical way to deal with them and try to evoke some change in the urban community. So the Building Boss Up Network is focused on entrepreneurship as the pathway to collective cooperative economics, and that's what our focus is on. So on building Black-owned businesses, uniting them, creating a network where they're able to prosper collectively, and that's what we own. That's the path.
Is there a deliberate media war on Black consciousness?
Well, yeah, I believe that there's a deliberate media war to curtail Black consciousness. It's not so much a matter of them attempting to change what is, but to prevent something from happening. So there is no collective Black consciousness because of the influence of the media on determining the perception of ideas and beliefs that are, propagated to us. So, since we've been in this country, we got to know that there's been an intent to ensure that our thinking falls in line with what's necessary for the system to maintain, its functionality, and not what's necessary for our freedom or our empowerment or any other sort. Black people were brought to this country to play a role. And after that period of time ended, the role didn't change. It just became less forceful. That's where the media came in, is to ensure that you will continue to play that role without us having to force you to. So if we look at slavery, you were brought here to build up an economy. And after slavery, they had to ensure that you continue to play the role that will build up their economy. So, it's always been economic. So if we talk about what the media has done pertaining to the ideas that Black people have about themselves, it's always been an economic factor at the root of it, on top of the racist.
When you just said that was real powerful, because I'm thinking about how modern times, it's the same thing. They just using modern tools for the same objective.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Right, absolutely. So, mass communication is an effective tool to convince a people, a population, to do anything. Mass communication is the most effective form of propaganda, because then you ain't got to worry about it being spread person to person. Now you got a medium where you can spread the same message to people all across the country and they receive it. That's one of the things that always got me when I was coming up. So I came up in Wisconsin, and lived in the ghettos in Racine and Milwaukee. But then I had my family from Chicago, so I would go there, see the same ghettos. My mother traveled a lot. We've been to Memphis, we've been to Detroit, we've been to Oklahoma, and always seen the same ghettos. What made those ghettos the same wasn't so much as the economic condition as it was the psychology of the individuals that lived there. And I always wonder, how is it that you can have people in different ghettos across America thinking the same? How do we think the same when we come from different areas? And that's where that massive tool comes from. It ensures that what we want to be perceived as something cultural worthy or something cultural can be mass produced, and thereby affecting the mass amount of people who don't even realize how they think the same, as others do. I had homies in the hood in Wisconsin that acted the same way as the homies that I met in the other places that I've been, every ghetto, every city. So when we talk about, the tools of control, which is what it is. We talk about tools of control. Mass communication is the most effective way to ensure that you can control a mass amount of people without them even realize that they're being controlled.
If you know everything about a person, then you can control that person. If you know everything about a group of people, you can absolutely control a group of people.
Right, absolutely. And that's something that most people don't realize. You look at social media, you look at it as, this big entertainment thing, and you all on Facebook, you're on Instagram, whatever, and you sharing, and you look at it as a way that, you can, entertain yourself and, interact with others. But you got to look at these corporations, data, like you said, is real powerful. And social media is for the people who collect and gather data and the people who need it. Social media is either you a shooter or you a target. You know what I'm saying? Either you own social media and you giving information, or you own social media and you using that information to promote whatever it is you trying to promote. It has been revolutionary for companies to go from passive advertising, which, TV and radio was more passive, to where they put out a message and they hope that it hit whoever it is that they're trying to get to.
Absolutely.
But now with social media, we ain't the message can be real specific to go to a specific audience, and we can make sure that it's designed in a manner in which that audience is going to respond to. So that's why they like to have you play games and share this and share that. All of that is just data. It's all data that's available to any advertiser, which is how these social media companies make their money, from advertisers. They don't care. The user is that's the hook. We can tell them, we got 5 million people here. Not only do we got 5 million people on our site, we got the data on these 5 million people. We know what they like, what they don't like, where they go, where they don't go, who they connected to, what values are important to them. We got all of this data just here. That makes us more valuable than if we had been collecting membership fees from these 5 million people. We give them a free place to gather, and then we gather all the information that they're, putting out, and then now we got an even more valuable product than we would charging them directly. So
we can control these people.
Right, and we can control them. And then that goes to another thing, is because it's just like if you let's say you living with a spouse or something, and they know how to push your buttons. You know what I'm saying? Because they know what to say to get you upset. They know exactly what to do to get you upset, because they've been around you long enough and they've been able to tell, like, I know this is gonna, create this type of response. Well, that's how
absolutely
democratic societies operate, man. The more that they can control their population, then the more power that they have, over individuals, and the more ability they have to maintain the position that they have in the society. And it's all about the data. It's all about being able to know exactly what to do. And that's why very easily they can create an emotional response, particularly in Black people. And they use these incidents, that are amplified. And sensationalized. So, you can take, we from the hood, we know the police beat up, Negroes every day. How many times have you seen the police? It's a common thing. They'll come and throw you up against the wall. Ain't no cameras around. The media, and then you think that you sharing information on social media, you think it's organic. Somebody shared it, it spread, and now everybody is aware of it. That ain't how that works. The algorithm is what determines if it's gonna go to so many people. You can put something on there and it'll never be heard about if they don't want it to be heard about. So they still have control, even though you posting on social media and you think you doing so, and it's just, they controlling the narrative. They make sure they control the narrative, and they know how easy it is to peg Black people emotions with certain incidents, and some they'll tell you about, some you'll never even hear about. Some you'll hear about years later, man. And years later pop up and you see a social media post, this Black dude was killed running from the police, this happened in 2021. What the? So it's all a control, a controlled environment. And I think, overall, it would be naive for people to believe that you live in a society that those who run the society don't exercise some type of control over the population. That's just naive. You think we're gonna leave it to chance that you gonna obey?
Right.
That don't make no sense.
Yeah. Yeah, you spoke about my next point, which was evoking emotion. And evoking emotion is really, really powerful, simply because I mean, that's how you control people. You control people through emotions. Like if I can, it's a saying that he who angers you controls you.
Right.
And so that's what that is. It's just,
Absolutely.
if I can get you mad, I know, like you said, the spouse pushing the button, it's the same thing.
Right.
It's control.
Right. On
It's
a
nothing
societal
different.
level. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go back to the beginning of civilization as we know it.
Okay.
Right? I'm not sure if this is a debated point. I'm not sure if, people that study history all understand that this is what it is.
Right.
But can you tell me a little bit about, what it is? Tell me a little bit about the first civilization.
well, I mean, that's definitely, I would say, a contentious topic. I would definitely say, no, there is an agreement, historically on, that particular subject. But from all research, has indicated, which thankfully we had to have our own researchers, because as we know, history is told from the vantage point of the victors, of course, right? And Western society, European society are the victors right now. So the history that we understand is not so much as it being told by them, but it being told from their perspective, from their state of the world, from where they are. And that's what we call Eurocentrism. So when we look at the history of other nations, particularly if you live in the West, then you have a Eurocentric worldview. And that just simply means that you were taught history from the vantage point of the Europeans based on their encounter and their interactions and experience with other civilizations. And what that does is that just enables them to paint a picture that puts them as the core of everything else that's happening. It all starts, particularly in America. When you learn about history in America, you start and you learn about the European history, you learn about the Queen of England, King George, and, King James and the Magna Carta and all, they immediately transition from European history into American history. And that's the transmission, So when it pertains to a people who were thrown into that mix, who didn't come from a European experience, your history was never told, and it was important that you didn't know how you got to where you are, because that would change how you felt about yourself, and we couldn't have you thinking you were anything other than what we wanted you to be for us. So when we look at history, even objectively, the earliest civilization on this planet is what we call the Nile Valley civilization. There's been a lot of misinformation put out and a lot of lies, historical lies about what the Nile Valley civilization was. You think Egypt, but it wasn't Egypt. Egypt is literally the last phase of the Nile Valley civilization.
Okay.
And that's even with it having 5,000 plus year history. Prior to that, when we talk about the Nile Valley civilizations, we're going further south, right? And further south is where we get to nations like Nubia, or what we would say Ta-Nehisian. The Nehisian civilization, the Nehisian culture is the earliest expression of the Nile Valley civilization. Okay. Nehisian, when I say Nehisian, just think Nubian, right? So when you say Nubian, just think modern day Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, like Eastern Africa, but below Egypt, because that happened last. And what happened was that civilization, it followed the trail of the Nile. So the Nile flows up, right? We know it don't flow down. It flows up. It flows south to north. And that's why in Egypt, you had what was called Upper and Lower Egypt. And Lower Egypt was the top part. Upper Egypt was the bottom part because of how the Nile flows. So when we looking at the Nile Valley civilization, it begins in the interior of Eastern Africa and it spread up following the trail of the Nile. And Egypt was its last expression. So those early Nile Valley civilizations, before there was a boundary line, what created a boundary line in the Nile Valley civilization was the influx of foreigners coming into the land from the northern part, which would be, we would say, modern day Middle East, right? it's kind of difficult to give those people a racial connotation, because in actuality they were descendants of the same people that were, they were descendants of the same Nile Valley, people, but they had migrated to that Middle Eastern part so far along in history that by the time they came back, they were a different people, and being a different people, that's where the difference in the civilization, the boundary line began to happen. And what they would do is these foreigners will continuously push the native people in the Nile Valley civilization further south, further south, further south. And that's where you get the idea of sub-Saharan, African, because, these foreign populations who came in who were still melanated people, they just had a different culture. And ultimately they will continue to push the people further south and claim the glory of the civilization that was being left behind. So when we talk about the Nile Valley civilization, the greatest testament to the existence of that civilization now lies beneath the Aswan Dam in Egypt, because that region was the seat of the Nubian power. And when they built that dam, and this dam was built in like the 1930s and 1940s, but what that did was that prevented excavations from being made in the land to find out what type of artifacts or what type of history we can find in this dirt that shows the origins of Egypt. And that's why they did it, because the Arabs wanted to claim that glorious history for themselves, and say, oh, the Egyptians were Arabs. Of course they were Arabs. How can we prove that the Egyptians weren't Arabs if we can prove where the Egyptians came from? You can't prove where they came from if we destroyed the site that would have gave you the information that showed you where they came from. You'll never get that. So now when we look at it and we say, the reason why we start at the Nile Valley civilization is because whether you South African, West African, Central African, whatever culture or society you came from Africa, before any of that existed, the Nile Valley civilization started there first. And the people from that civilization literally migrated away into the other regions to become the cultures that you see today. How do we know this? Sheikh Anta Diop wrote a book called The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, where he literally traced the language, the culture, the migration patterns of all of these different tribes across the continent of Africa and traced it all back to the Nile Valley civilization. That was gangster. But that's some information that you don't hear about. They call our history pseudo history. When you get to talking about, what we did or where we come from, it's all pseudo, because they don't want you to make that connection. They don't want you to connect yourself to any type of transmission of or legacy of greatness. And they don't want you to connect to any type of transmission that's going to unite you with Black people across the diaspora. Right, absolutely. They want you to think, oh no, you're separated in different tribes, and y'all different tribes and different languages, y'all different people. And yeah, of course, that's, beneficial. That's a psychology that's more beneficial to you than it is to us, But when we look at history from the vantage point of our own scholarship, then we will see that transmission has been very well defined. Sheikh Anta Diop was one of the best that did it, but there were tons of other Black scholars who went and did their own independent research, even, obtained degrees on archaeology and sociology and anthropology and cosmology and, all of these different disciplines, because they wanted to have an independent understanding separate from the Eurocentric viewpoint that they knew they were getting from these universities. So they studied multiple different disciplines so that they would have the tools to be able to analyze history in through their own vantage point, through their own viewpoint, and then give that to us. So I always recommend people, if you really want to understand the knowledge of self as, a Black person, then you want to go and look up that scholarship and look at some of the immense work that they've already done, in order to give that history back to you.